To begin, let's ground the conversation in the fundamentals. From each of your perspectives, I'd like to know what makes acquisition a strategic and effective lever for growth, and what should leaders assess internally before deciding whether M&A aligns with their scale-up strategy. Eva, maybe I'll come over to you first.
Yeah, so thank you. Great question. So there are two questions here. I'd like to answer each one separately. So on the first one, acquisition being a strategic lever. So M&A, as we all know, is inorganic growth that accelerates something that we can easily build ourselves. So whether it's enhancing revenue growth, EBITDA growth, market access, product enhancement, or scale, really allows companies to leapfrog stages rather than growing organically, which takes much longer period. And the second part of the question, what should leaders assess internally? So for us, at a minimum, deals need to be financially accretive with a clear path to value creation, whether through revenue synergies, cost synergies, or strategic positioning. And what we do other than financial due diligence is also we place significant emphasis on risk due diligence. So particularly, let's say, on cybersecurity. We have, in fact, walked away from deals after identifying that there's vulnerabilities in pen testing that exceeded our risk tolerance. But for us, financial and risk due diligence is really only part of the story. The most important consideration when I consider M&A 101 is really culture fit. So in my experience, deals don't fail because of the model or different due diligence we've done. They fail because of misalignment between buyer and seller. So, if there's differences in decision making, leadership expectations, or risk tolerance, that can really quickly break trust in the relationship. And sometimes, if we lack cultural alignment during the due diligence phase, we actually walked away from deals, no matter how strong the deal looks on paper. And another way to think about it, and I always talk to people and other people that are really starting M&A, is M&A is really like a marriage, right? So when you do due diligence, it's really like dating, right? You're assessing each other, not just on the business, it's really how each side operates. And then when you sign a purchase agreement, it's like signing a marriage license. The journey has just begun. And the real work begins really post signing the agreement is really where you're building a future together, integrating teams, aligning priorities, and establishing trust.
Thanks for that comprehensive answer. As you were going through it, some of the points that I thought I would raise, you've sort of covered, but a great starter for us. I mean, I guess I look at M&A, our first poll question sort of touched on one of the key facets of, what we're strong at is a province in British Columbia, and that was talent. So I look at these opportunities for M&A as an opportunity to acquire scarce talent at scale. It shouldn't be your primary driver, as certainly as Eva's alluded to. You'd be remiss not to think about all the financial implications and ramifications of a deal. So I often look at it that, can that 1 + 1 = 3 equation sort of work for us as far as an M&A is concerned? As far as certainly the second question about, what should leaders assess? They need to assess that they're ready for this. I mean, there's always a fascination with doing a transaction, but there's a whole lot to it, right? And we're going to talk about this, I think, a little later. We'll unpack it in a little more detail, but integration is so important in these deals. And having a leadership team that's sort of, quote unquote, been there, done that with M&A, I think becomes all the more important. You might have a great product, a great technology, but if you've never done a deal, there's just so much to be thinking about. And having that opportunity and going in with your eyes open, I think can't be understated. So, just some comments from my perspective.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Bruce. Lisa, I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on what makes acquisition a strategic lever and what leaders should be thinking about.
Well, I'm on the other flip side of Eva, and I use the dating and marriage analogy all the time because it is exactly that. From my side, I'm going to start with the second part of the question, right, which is the internal assessment. And I can't emphasize from my point of view, just from the number of acquisitions I've been involved with, how important this is, right? Because really what we're trying to do is set the table and always be ready. And whether you're preparing for an acquisition or an equity investment or a partnership, at the end of the day, right, the record keeping and the governance really are fundamental to that success. And it really shouldn't be dismissed, which I sometimes see founders think about that. They're so busy with their product, it's not the most important thing. But, I'll go into that a little bit later, but that's so important. Everything from the fact that your contracts, can transfer cleanly over to a new party. The fact, whether you have the right protections in place, such as your moral obligations or your IP. And of course, just always being ready for due diligence, because you literally don't know when that opportunity will show up. And of course, you don't want to be scrambling to get ready when it happens. So it's always trying to be prepared. And then the first part of the question, of course, is what makes what is strategic about your acquisition. And again, I like to think about it as always think about, have the start with the end in mind, right? And why that's important, of course, is the preparation. But there was one company I worked with, and I thought it was a really great strategy, and it worked really well. And what we did in that instance was we brought strategic investors to the table, not one, but three. And I would say, a few, because you don't want to lock down your options, right? It was really a great way of doing it from our perspective. We got capital early. We got access to their networks and their customers and insight into their markets. And from their perspective, right, they got a front row seat to our technology and to how our business was developing. But, more importantly, too, is getting to know the team, and how they think, how they work together. And of course, it comes into cultural fit. But it was really the right balance, between tension and interest at the table. And there are a few guardrails, that we put in place. Obviously, we don't want any exclusives. We don't want to give any special rights to anyone. We allow them to have observer status at our boardroom. But of course, if we're talking about competitive strategy or anything that we needed to keep, private, we'd have them leave the room, right? But it was kind of nice to have them sit across the table from each other, right? They don't know what each other are planning to do, and it really keeps a nice a balance, and it helps us, prepare for the future. And that's my answer.
That's excellent. Thank you. Thanks for the examples. That's fantastic. I think you gave us a nice segue over to Emma on preparation being key. So Emma, I'll bring it over to you next on this question.
Yeah, and I really do want to kind of focus on preparation here. And as a founder, this question was, does M&A align with your scale up strategy? And the first step there is really making sure that you have a strategy, something that you understand is going to work for your company. How much cash do you need? How much control do you want? How much, what does your runway look like? When do you want to exit? There are people who will get an early opportunity at M&A, but aren't prepared to leave the business yet, or are needed for the business to a point that they will need to be involved long term. And an early strategic exit really means removing their ability to control their own company. And for them, maybe an early strategic or an early M&A of any kind really isn't the answer. Maybe the answer there is actually thanks, no thanks, or we're going to use this as a straw horse to get some better valuations on a venture financing, spend a little bit more time on scale before we do that exit. So I think, that first question is really understanding and being clear about what is your plan? how integral are you to, as the founder or key person, key people to that plan, and how does that play into an exit strategy at different stages of your company?
That's excellent. Thanks, Emma. I'm going to maybe lean into the lessons learned, because I do love Lisa sharing some examples. So I'm going to come to each of you. Thinking back on a specific acquisition you were involved with, I'd love to hear some, what's some of the biggest lessons learned that you took away that fundamentally changed how you approach deals going forward. So what was that game changer kind of moment? And Bruce, I'll come over to you first.
Sure. Thanks, Erica. I guess for me, integration, maybe in capital letters was the lesson learned. I'm thinking of a deal that we did. It was probably more than 10 years ago. And actually, had firsthand I had involvement more at the outset and sort of saw the movie and where it was maybe headed. And I think a lot of time is often spent up front assessing the target, spending time together, learning about cultural fit, obviously all the financial metrics behind, is this a deal worth pursuing, and all that detail. Obviously, as an accountant, you'd be remiss not to be doing all of that level of analysis. But then what ended up happening was the deal was done, everybody went in their respective corners. And obviously what I'm referring to is a deal that was across geographies. And so, headquarters was in one location and target was in another. And the sense was, okay, well, you being the acquired entity, just go about your business, you're part of us now, and assumed everything would work. And it doesn't quite maybe happen as well as people think without conscious thought. And the lesson learned for me, certainly, Erica, was I think there's often an overstatement, if you will, of a company's ability to integrate an acquisition. There's a lot to do, as I say, and it doesn't have to be complicated as far as this integration, but it's actually spending time with the acquired entity and making sure that just getting regular touch points from probably that same group that did the deal, because often they're just left to go about their own business. Technology might change as far as just getting them on a common platform, of the acquiring entity. But a lot of, there's a lot of this, okay, this was great, now what? And, I have seen where it just absolutely unraveled not long after the deal. Just because there wasn't that conscious focus on integration. So I think for me, Erica, that was something was learned, prominently, and it sort of stuck with me since that time is, what role can I play in making sure that actually happens effectively for a sustained period of time post-acquisition.
That's excellent. Thanks, Bruce. And I'm sure that's informed how you worked with clients, making sure they're thinking about the effort after, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Emma, I'd love to come to you next. If you could speak to maybe a specific acquisition you were involved with.
Well, for obvious reasons, I'm not going to give a deal name on this one, and it's one that's come up in different iterations a number of times. But I think the lesson that you kind of learn over and over again as you do this, or at least I have, is don't assume that people know what they're talking about or that they know exactly what they want. Sometimes people will propose with a great deal of confidence about what they think is a solution to an underlying problem. And they'll say, I want to do X. And the thing that is sometimes problematic is that counsel doesn't always ask, or advisors don't always ask, well, why do you want to do X? What are you actually trying to achieve? X might be, I want to give everybody a bonus of $8 million, and I want it to be paid 7 years from now. That might sound like a reasonable business thing, but from a legal perspective, that's actually quite hard. It has tax implications. It's hard to track down employees. And so, you can send legal wheels spinning and costs spinning when people just take it at their word that, well, that's what they want to do. That's the business deal. They want to give people this amount of money. The actual thing that needs to happen is there needs to be an underlying conversation as to what the ultimate goal is at the end of the day, to see if there is a more efficient way of getting there. Employee bonuses is just one. This happens all the time where people get super stuck or confidently presenting something that they feel that they want, but really what they're trying to get at is an underlying goal that hasn't been made clear. And I think that one of the biggest lessons that I have learned and that I like to try to get at over and over again when I get into these situations is really understanding what's the ultimate goal and what is then the most efficient way to get there.
That's excellent. Thank you. Digging deeper into what the real strategy is and how you can deliver it. I'd love to come over to you, Lisa, if you could maybe share from your experience an acquisition you were involved with and that biggest lesson that you took away from it.
It's a great question. I actually had to think back because I've been involved in a number of acquisitions, and some were great and some were okay. And of course, there's a ton of lessons to learn from that. But the one that really stuck out for me was it's not over until it's over. I saw this really clearly in the company that I was involved with. We had a great technology. We were improving voice recognition engines by extracting voice from noise, right? And we were at a turning point in the company's life. We needed to raise another round of funding, but it was right after the dot-com boom, so the bust. So I'm dating myself a bit, but that's when it was. And our existing investors didn't want to follow on. Everyone was jittery, and we couldn't get some new investors at the table because they weren't convinced that the mobile market was big enough at the time. This was before the iPhone. So at that time, we immediately pivoted into the automotive space because the problem was real. Voice accuracy in cars was poor because of the background noise. And if you think about this, if I call out a 10-digit phone number with 70% accuracy, I'm going to get a wrong phone number every single time. So because we hadn't secured funding, right, this triggered a material adverse condition that we had to notify our lenders. And I remember that call because it was a lot more language than I was used to. This was earlier in my career, and it was pretty intimidating. But essentially what they said to us is we had 1 week before they would pull their collateral, which is essentially the company. So at that point, we were at the edge. And instead of stepping back, what we did was we had to push forward quickly. We actually got in touch with a competitor of our beta customer and let them know that there was, we're about to do a transaction and there was an imminent change of ownership, and it was their opportunity to throw their hat in the ring and to do it quickly. And believe it or not, they flew out that week. And by the end of the weekend, we had a paper napkin deal. And it wasn't a bad deal. It was actually very attractive because they really didn't know our financial condition. And we did rush to close quickly because we didn't really have enough for a couple more payrolls. And in the end, our lenders said to us, we went from a D report card to a B+ in a matter of days, and our shareholders were very happy. So that lesson really has carried with me in everything that I do today. And I see, and I give advice to founders all the time who think that they're at the end. And I always say to them, it's not over until it's over. So just keep going right to that cliff.
I love the resilience. I'm not going to ask you how much sleep you got that week. But
90 days.
That's a fantastic story. Thank you for that. And excellent advice. Eva, I'm going to come over to you next, and I wouldn't even want to quote the number that I think Well Health has acquired in terms of acquisitions during their time, but I know it's over 100. Maybe you'll tell me what the number is. But you'll have to choose maybe one or a few that from your experience have changed the way that you approach deals. Yeah,
thank you. So again, very similar to I think what Lisa and Emma have kind of mentioned, really details matters. So I've done, I think over my whole career journey, I've done over 100 deals, right? Big or small. And early on, I saw how the deal structure and clarity and over communication really works to make sure that really have clarity on deal structure. So, for example, sometimes there's deal structure where you have time-based earnout or performance-based earnout where in the future, right? So when you have future payment where the sellers or the founders of the companies you bought, they need to achieve certain performance milestone in order to get some future payments. And sometimes these deals were agreed in principle, but sometimes without proper documentation or clear examples on how they actually will be calculated. So then I've seen a lot of examples, again, early on in my career where post-close, then there's a lot of contention or dispute and sometimes even between the parties and even between the lawyers, right? Sometimes, and I know Emma probably would have seen that, sometimes one word in the agreement can be interpreted differently by different people. And that sometimes costs, again, more time and effort spent on dealing with the issues, and sometimes maybe costs the purchaser more money because of the different differences in interpretation. So again, details matter, and I always push for every single explicit definitions of some of the deal terms, and make sure there's illustrative examples, right? Put the example together, walk through it with the seller to make sure that, hey, this is how time-based earnouts or performance-based earnout will be calculated in the future, so that there's very clear, everybody's aligned, and everything's documented. It's not just a handshake or verbal agreement. So again, over communication upfront to avoid issues later.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. We've kind of touched on this earlier, but I think Bruce said it best when he said capital, all caps integration. And it's come up a few times in the conversation. So let's talk about post-acquisition. What happens afterwards? And what have you all learned about integrating teams, products, and culture in a way that it gets it right? So I'd love to come around to you and dig a bit deeper into this. So Lisa, over to you first.
Honestly, right up until the deal closes, it's a bit of a roller coaster, right? One moment it's about to happen, it's coming together. The next moment it's falling apart. So the stress, the back and forth really becomes a key focus. So that means that we're not really thinking about post-acquisition, right? We're all pre-acquisition. And just a note on the pre-acquisition, because this was a lesson that I did learn a while ago, is the communication with the team as you're going through the acquisition. You think that you're trying to keep your team from, not worrying about the acquisition and focusing on their work, but the silence, right, means that they'll start to form their own narrative. And what you're trying to do is keep your team intact and focus on the business. And if you don't fill in that space for them, then they will. And that's where, you lose a lot of, it actually can be quite risky. And luckily in that particular acquisition that I'm thinking about, we caught on to that. And then we made sure they knew exactly what was going on. Even though nothing was really happening, we were always in a waiting game, right? But to follow up on this question, once the deal closes, then everything changes. And, I think that not a lot of thought is considered. Like you're part of a much larger organization, and yet you're used to, having your own culture. You have your own processes. They have their culture. They have their priorities, and those priorities may not be the same. And definitely, actually, in most cases, are not the same priorities. Right? It's in a different direction. So where we were, always focused on growth and market expansion, the acquiring company, comes to us with much more of a focus on their own strategy, on their bottom line performance and integration, right? And so that part of the transition is actually very difficult. You go through the honeymoon period where everything's great, it's so much fun. I remember in one instance, I was always desperate to make payroll on Friday, and all of a sudden I just had to pick up the phone, call head office, wire money over. That was nice And then all of a sudden it was kind of not very challenging, right? Yeah, and you move from a high degree of autonomy, right, to operating, to suddenly operating in a structured environment where they have policies and they have constraints. And on top of that, you're committed to stay on. That's part of the agreement, right? I know I had a lockup period for 2 years and we had KPIs, and of course we want to earn up. So you want to achieve those targets. So it's so you're locked in, but part of me personally, it's really difficult to be, in the same place. So I think that is something to really think about and prepare for, right? But what it does mean, because you do want it to be successful, all the employees are happy, they've got a great job, and you want to protect that, right? So it's really important to really dive in and align quickly as possible with the operating model of your acquirer, right? You need to adopt their systems and their processes and really sync up the cultures together, so that everyone is performing well, right? And if you can get clear on, what that success looks like in their environment, then I think, it actually is better for everyone and it becomes a lot more fun if you can get that place.
That's excellent. Thank you. Eva, I'll come over to you next here. I'm sure you've got a bit of a playbook for this, baby, or an approach. What does it take to get it right afterwards in terms of post-acquisition and integrating the teams and the products and culture?
So yeah, so you know how sometimes when there's emergency situation, the first 72 hours is the golden period, right? So in M&A, the first 100 days post-acquisition are absolutely critical. This is where you either build momentum or create friction that's hard to unwind later. So change management right during this period is really key. And the integration team and the integration manager plays a really pivotal role. So I again, back to the marriage example, I think of integration as like moving into a house together after getting married. So both sides need to collaborate, adjust, and co-create to the best way of working. And it cannot be one-sided, right? And we cannot have like me versus you kind of the mentality. So I have an example where in the early days, probably 7-8 years ago, when we first bought our first physio clinic in Vancouver, and the integration manager on my team didn't really fully understand how physio clinics work. What is it's a very different EMR system processes, But then I guess again not familiar with the new clinic. So she forced the other side to adopt our processes. So then that really created resistance, and then and really lost a lot of trust in the first 100 days, and it ultimately took a long time to rebuild the trust and the relationship together. So and then another lesson that in our playbook is really try, if possible, try to, and I think Emma talked about that, to really start the integration planning early, right? Ideally, before signing, have a longer interim period before between signing the agreement and before final closing. Try to have an interim period where it allows time to do proper integration planning, whether it's synergy planning, and sometimes maybe there's closing conditions where we want the sellers to fix certain things before you take over the asset. This is the time where you can plan better, collaborate better to really have a vision of what integration or post-close integration will look like. And as soon as that planning is done, once the final close is here, we can close the deal, then you move straight to execution. So just like any project, right? Do more upfront planning, and the integration will become much easier when the deal's closed. So again, thoughtful planning, strong integration leadership, and a collaborative mindset from day one.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that, Eva. I'll pass it over to Emma, maybe to talk about that preparation a bit more that Eva mentioned.
Yeah, so just I think to build on some of the things that Eva mentioned and to focus in a little bit more, as we all know, these businesses are all about people and the talent that they bring, and that's really what's going to propel most businesses forward and upward. And so making sure that, some of the bad deal behavior that you see is when the acquirer holds back on the key employment agreements for the folks who are going to be absolutely critical for this business moving forward. They present them, the night before you're supposed to sign, and then there's a ton of pressure and there's not a lot of conversation between the acquirer and the seller about what those should look like. So I always find that a little bit of a red flag, because you're leaving your key management team feeling a little bit burned, used, taken advantage of before we even get there. And the other thing that I like to suggest is not only that we start that process a little bit early, but that in doing so, that acquirers talk with the sellers to ensure that the way that you are incentivizing those key players in the post-closing space actually makes sense and aligns with metrics that they have personal involvement in. If you give kind of 200 employees an overarching EBITDA goal, that can feel very dissociative, and particularly for senior members. And so I really think that it pays dividends to understand who those key players are, how they get incentivized, work with them early, and ensure that they are fully bought into this integration plan and to this new company, because they are the ones who are going to build that culture for everybody else within your organization. And as part of that, it's as Eva mentioned, it's a very delicate dance, and you do this a lot. When you get deep into these complex or, high pitch closings, people get tired. And the people who get the most tired tend to be that core management team, because they are expected to not only do all of the closing steps, they're being pushed on disclosure schedules, they're being pushed on making sure that they understand everything with respect to the closing itself. They're also being pushed at the same time on moving this integration piece forward. And so taking a step back, making sure that in the lead up to the closing, you've got that work allocation set out so that you're not completely burning out your key people, I think is really important, because as Eva mentioned, the 100 days post-closing are going to be just as busy, challenging, perhaps more so for your operations team than the lead up. And so making sure that you're moving tasks around in a way that doesn't result in everybody on day one just being like, I'm done, I'm out, I need a break. Because that's, in my world, the worst way to start off a company.
Yeah, you don't want to sprint to the finish line. You got to remember that there's still another leg to the race, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Bruce, I'd love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Erica. I'll pick up a comment that Lisa, made, when she was going through this question, was just this, this absence of communication. Sometimes there's a quiet period, and if you're an employee in the acquired entity, you're just, sometimes you form your own conclusions with any sort of baseline, because again, you haven't been part of the deal itself. So it was just sort of thrust upon you that, oh boy, we've been acquired. So what does that actually mean? So I think having that clarity and decisiveness as the company that's actually the acquirer amongst the people, identifying the talent, the key talent, and providing them with likely a reason to stay. Emma talked a little bit about some of the financial reasons that might otherwise compel them to stay, but just it becomes more of that. Just giving them roles within the combined organization, and again, a sense of purpose and belonging, because often they're sort of, we'll call it the forgotten ones. The deal's happened, it's just assumed that, well, okay, I'm just going to march ahead with this new organization. So I think you've got to step back. It's all about the people, substantially in these transactions, and give them clarity of purpose. And you can't over communicate, I think, in that early sort of 100-day period that Eva had alluded to as well, around like, what am I doing? Sometimes I think there's an assumption, a faulty assumption, that it's just going to work, right? The alignment will be there. But no, you've got to get under the hood and actually communicate with people, identify your stars and your key performers that maybe weren't part of the deal team, but they're integral to the future success of the organization, and make sure they've got substantive roles in this new merged entity. So that's really what's important to me in assessing these opportunities.
That's excellent. Thank you. I'm keeping an eye on time. I want to make sure we get to some of our audience questions. So I'm going to pop over to that now. I did see one question that was raised from the audience asking about how do you approach integration with a remote workforce? So I'm curious if folks have any kind of insights into that dynamic. When many teams now are hybrid or remote, it's a little bit maybe more challenging to get people together or on board with the same vision. Eva, maybe I can come to you on this one.
Yeah, so I think, again, back to what Bruce said, communication, right? So we have a playbook, make sure that whatever's discussed, share, document meeting minutes, sharing all the files, right? Just really communication to make sure that everybody is clear. When we're not in the same room together, everybody remotely has the same document, same vision, same strategy.
I'll leave it out to the floor to see if anyone else wants to jump in on this one.
I'm with Eva on those comments, because whether it's remote or just, different geographies, just that communication. And obviously we've got all sorts of methods of communication to share a common message to people. And, it may come down to one-on-one that I'm talking to Eva directly because she's a key member of my team. And I want to make sure she's, feeling empowered. What do you think of this deal? And so I think it's probably that direct reach out in many instances to some of the, call it the stars in that organization that you otherwise acquire, to make sure they're feeling invested in this new organization.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that, really, I think the key is really trying to really have an integration manager, right? Somebody just pull the team together, right?
That's great. I'm going to go to our next question, and Lisa, I'm going to tee this one up to you. The question, we kind of touched on it in some of the earlier dialogue, but how do teams manage the distraction and effort that comes with running a deal alongside running the business? So I wondered if you might be able to comment on how do you kind of manage that, alongside the day-to-day work and operations that you have to oversee.
As I alluded to earlier, we try to keep that separate, and that almost scuttled the deal there. So being very open to the communications, but really making sure everyone knows what swim lane they're in and what their responsibilities are. So, it's so important for everyone to have their own KPIs and their own targets that they need to perform on, while the other folks, focus on the actual acquisition itself, because it does take an enormous amount of resources. But then I would go back to the fact that, preparation is everything. So if you're dealing with an acquisition and your data room is not in order, and you don't have the proper governance documents in place, and you've got, think they're, GANAPs, right? Not only is that risk, but that could definitely kill the deal if there's liabilities that arise, and I've seen that happen. But just trying to keep everyone lined up to what they need to focus on and being prepared.
Emma, do you want to tag in on this one?
I think that the only other thing I would add to Lisa's comments, which I completely agree with, would just be, there is going to be some pain involved in these closings, and you can try to give people defined tasks as much as possible, but I also think it's helpful just to acknowledge that hard things, and we're all going to be in this together, but this is going to involve a little bit of extra time to get us over this finish line, and here's why it's going to be worth it at the end of the day. So really kind of framing it up as acknowledging that, yes, this is going to be extra work for everyone, myself included. We are all in this together, and we are doing it because this is going to be the outcome, and that is going to be a positive for all of us involved, and really kind of pulling on that team mentality to move it forward.
Can I just make one comment here, because it goes along with what Emma's saying. in working with some companies, I see that they're really reticent to get the professionals involved. That's expensive. That's gonna, we can use those resources elsewhere. But I can say just, if you have a solid relationship with your legal counsel, with your accounting support teams, they can help step in at the right time to get this transaction through. And if they know your business well, then that gives so much leverage. And I think that that's really important to develop those relationships and don't get lost in the expensive, because it can be a lot more costly later.
That's a fantastic point, Lisa. Making sure you have the right team around you. And certainly Bruce and Emma are excellent resources. I will maybe take us now to my final question, because we're coming up on time. And we'll end this on a kind of a positive note. I know we have lots of really ambitious startups who join us for these sessions, and they're on the line with us now. So they have big ambitions, and I'd love to hear from each of you kind of what key takeaways or advice you might share with those folks on the line that they should take away from today's session. And Emma, I'll come to you first.
Sure. I think my key takeaway would be, don't be afraid to have the hard conversations. Have them early, have them often, get at the root of what people actually have concerns about, and make sure that you're then communicating that out to your team. I think that honesty is the basis for great long-term partnerships, and it's absolutely key for these types of big M&A.
Fantastic. Lisa, what are your kind of closing words?
The key points from my point of view is, first, build with the future in mind. Second is, make sure you build in optionality, right? Don't close any paths because you don't know where it's going to go. Third one is, run your business with discipline. Don't let that go, and don't think that you're going to fix it later. And then finally, and most importantly, don't forget your team and make sure that they're with you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. Bruce, over to you.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective is, maybe build something that works before you think about scaling it. Maybe you've got this vision of a grandiose vision, but let's make sure what you have works first. And I also think quality versus quantity. If you build a talented team, and don't be too fussed with how many people you have on that team, build talent quality trumps quantity, in those early days, and because you're building something in those initial, that initial period. So, focus on the talent and the quality of that talent, and it'll morph. Just rest assured, patience is a virtue, as they say.
Excellent advice. Eva, I'll give you the last word here.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, again, back to M&A 101, culture fit, right? If make sure that it's the right culture, communicate upfront, build the trust upfront, thinking that the angle is we're going to build something together, right? What's the angle? INETCO, right? What's the angle? We're going to make sure that it's the same. Everybody has the same strategy, the same vision, and it's going to be part of a family together. So this is the right fit, right?
It's fantastic. Well, I'm very thankful to the four of you for sharing your time and your insights. It's so helpful to hear from others who've been through it and who could share those lessons learned with our members. And so thank you for taking the time to be here with us today.